Chapter 11: The River Floods. The Sierra rivers are flooded every spring by the melting of the snow, as regularly as the famous old Nile. They begin to rise in May, and in June high water mark is reached. But because the melting does not go on as rapidly over all the mountains, high and low simultaneously, and the melted snow is not reinforced at this time by the years of rain, the spring floods are seldom very violent or destructive. A thousand falls, however, and the cascades and the canyons are then in full bloom and sing songs from one end of the range to the other. Of course, the snow on the lower tributaries of the river is first melted, then that on the higher fountains, most exposed to sunshine, and about a month later, the cooler, shadowy fountains send down their treasures, thus allowing the main trunk streams nearly 6 weeks to get their waters hurried through the bound hills and across the lowlands to the sea. Therefore, very violent spring floods are avoided and will be as long as the shading of raining forest lasts. The rivers of the north half of the range are still less subject to the sudden floods, because their upper fountains in great part lie protected from the changes of the weather beneath thick folds of lava, just as many folds of the river of Alaska lie beneath folds of ice, coming to the light further down the range in large springs, while those of the High Sierra lie on the surface in solid granites exposed to every change of the temperature. More than 90% of the water derived from the snow and ice of the Mount Shasta is at once absorbed and drained away beneath the porous lava folds of the mountain. Where mumbling and groping in the dark valley, they at length find larger fissures and tunnel-like caves from which they emerge, filtered and cool in the form of large springs. Some of them so large they give birth to rivers that set out on their journeys beneath the sun without any visible intermediate period of childhood. Thus, the Shasta River issues from a large lake-like spring in Shasta Valley, and about 2/3 of the volume of the Cloud River gushes forth suddenly from the face of a lava buff in a roaring spring, 75 yards wide. The rivers of the north are, of course, shorter than those of the south, whose tributaries extend to the tops of the mountains. Fall River, an important tributary of the Pitt or Upper Sacramento, is about 10 miles long and is all falls, cascades, and springs from its head to its confluence with the Pitt. Beautiful springs, charmingly embowered, with issue from the rocks at one end of it. A snowy fall 180 feet high thunders as the other, and a rush of crystal rapids sing and dance between. Of course, such streams are but little affected by the weather. Sheltered from an evaporation, their flow is nearly as full in the autumn as in time of the general spring floods, while those of the High Sierra diminish to less than 100th parts of their springtime prime, swallowing an autumn into a series of silent pools among the rocks and howlers of their channels in winter, when one would suppose all their wild waters would be muffled and chained in frost and snow. The same long, all-day storms of the so-called rainy season in California that give rain to the lowlands give dry frosty snow to the mountains, but at rare intervals warm rains and warm winds invade the mountains and push back the snow line from 2,000 feet to 8,000, or even higher, and then come the big floods. Was usually driven down of the high Sierra about the end of November, but the winter of 1874 and 1875 was so warm and calm that I was tempted to seek general views of the geology and topography of the basin of the River in January, and I had just completed a hasty survey of the region and made my way down to winter quarters when one of the coldest grand floods of storms that I have ever saw broke on the mountains, and I was then in at the edge of the main forest belt at a small foothill town called Knoxville, on the divide between the waters of the Feather and the Yuba River. The cause of this notable flood was simply a sudden and copious fall of warm wind and rain on the basins of these rivers at a time when they contained a considerable quantity of snow. The rain was so heavy and long sustained that it was of itself sufficient to make a good wild flood, while the snow which the warm wind and rain melted on the upper and middle regions of the basin was sufficient to make another flood equal to that of the rain. Now these two distinct harvests of flood waters were gathered simultaneously and poured out on the plain in one magnificent avalanche. The basins of the Yuba and the Feather, like many others of the Sierra, are admirably adapted to the growth of wild floods of this area. Their many tributaries radiate far and wide, comprehending extensive areas, and the tributaries are steeply inclined, while the trunks are comparatively level. While the flood storms was in progress, the thermometer at Knoxville ranged between 44 degrees and 50 degrees, and when warm wind and rain fall simultaneously and snow contained in basins like these, both the rain and the portion of the snow which the rain and wind melt are first sponged up, held up, back up until combined mass becomes sludge, which at length, suddenly dissolving, this slips and descends altogether to the trunk channel. And since the deeper the stream, the faster it flows, the combined portion of the current above overtakes the slower foothill portion below it, and all sweeping forward together with a high over-curling front, debouches on the open plain, with a violence and suddenness that at first seem wholly unaccountable. The destructiveness of the lower portion of this particular flood was somewhat augmented by mining gravel in the river channels, and by levees which gave way after having at first restrained and held back the accumulating waters. These exaggerating conditions did not, however, greatly influence the general result, the main effect having been caused by the rare combination of flood factors indicated above. It is a pity that but few people meet and enjoy storms so noble as this in their homes in the mountains. For spending themselves in the open levels of the plains, they are likely to be remembered more by the bridges and houses. They carry away more than their beauty or their thousand blessings they bring to the fields and gardens of nature. On the morning of the flood, January 19th, all the Feather and Yuba landscapes are covered with running water, muddy torrents filled with every gulch and ravine, and the sky was thick with rain. The pines had long been sleeping in sunshine. They were now awake, roaring and waving with the beating storm, and the winds sweeping along the curves of hill and dale, streaming through the woods, surging and gurgling on the tops of rocky ridges, made the wildest of wild storm melody. It was easy to see only a small part of the rain reached the ground in the form of drops. Most of it was thrashed into dusty spray like that into which small waterfalls are divided, which they dash on shelving rocks. Never have I ever seen water coming from the sky in denser or more passionate streams. The wind chased the spray forward in choking drifts and compelled me again and again to seek shelter in the dell copses and back of the large trees to rest and catch my breath whenever I went on ridges or in hollows. Enthusiastic water still flashed and gurgled about my ankles, recalling a wild winter flood in Yosemite when 100 waterfalls came booming and chanting together and filled from the Grand Valley with a sea-like roar.